Thanks, Emily. Wow, those were great presentations from the city perspective and the private sector perspective. I'm really looking forward to moderating and joining in on this panel with you all. One thing I want to bring to the attention of attendees is the handout that was made part of an email that you got. So earlier today, you got a reminder email. In that email, you got a link that said to download a copy of the agenda, speaker bios, handouts. And one of those handouts that you got was the summary of benchmarking and green labeling programs. So this is just kind of a detailed breakdown of the cities that we've gone over today, and also San Jose in terms of the requirements and who's covered by their ordinances. And then there are green labeling program examples for Berkeley, Portland, Chicago, and Minneapolis. It might be handy to have this on your screen while we're entering this discussion with the cities and Zach. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. All right, so getting into the Q&A. I've got a few questions teed up here, but I would encourage attendees to also write them into the chat, and I'll do my best to pick out the ones that look relevant to share with the group. So Adrian, I want to start with you. Firstly, the industrial sector is often left out of state and local benchmarking programs, but Brisbane included due to the sector's high share of GHG emissions. I'm just curious, how did you engage this sector, and were there any lessons learned?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So as I mentioned, we really spent a lot of time looking at who our top building owners were and trying to reach out to them. We had a big effort last year with multiple workshops and webinars and lots of emails going out. And even then, we realized we were struggling to get folks' attention. So we went to some of those bigger owners one-on-one and asked, to just sit down with them, have a phone call, have an in-person meeting. And that was really where we got the best feedback, because we were able to walk through what we were thinking of with those owners, and then, have them jump in and say, well, we think this doesn't make sense because, this building type should be exempt, or this situation should be exempt, or, really that's where we learned the, concerns over those triple net leases and how we were going to be able to have that data access facilitated. So that really led to some of the things that we incorporated in our compliance pathways, as well as the green leasing option.
Great, thanks, Adrian. And then, Ammon, I just kind of wanted to generally ask, what lessons have you learned so far in implementing your ordinance with the City of Berkeley, at the City of Berkeley? And so far, kind of what changes are you considering for the near and long-term future?
So for lessons learned, I touched on some of them at the end of the presentation, but then some that I didn't were probably having your data infrastructure in place before you kind of start the ordinance. Over the past year, we've had to change all of our databases and update them to Salesforce, and that's then we've lost some data in the process. So that would be one, just getting things in order as much as you can before you start implementing the ordinance. And then as for additional changes, so along with our single family program and those updates, we are looking at building performance standards for our large buildings. And so buildings greater than 25,000 square feet, we're looking at proposing performance targets for those buildings. And then also lowering our benchmarking threshold to 15,000 square feet. So those are another two big updates that we'll have for our large building sector.
Awesome, that's good to know. Barry, I want to ask you, has the City of San Francisco looked into single family ordinances? Is the city considering adopting such an ordinance at any point in the near future? If so, what kind?
So San Francisco does have a RICO. It is essentially Berkeley's original RICO, still in effect, and it just as Berkeley observed a number of years ago, it's outdated with regard to energy. It's a limited number of prescriptive energy efficiency requirements and only applicable to residential buildings built before the energy code and who have never had to comply with the RICO before. It also, though, it does have a water efficiency requirement that's triggered at time of sale, and that is applicable to buildings of all types, commercial and residential. And that's been working a lot better, in part because prescriptive measures for water efficiency plus a leak check are a highly effective way to look at the basics of water efficiency. We have been looking at how to make better use of the ordinance that we have today and the data that we have today. And so you talked a little bit about the potential of layering together data. We actually have as a exercise to try to connect the city's climate action strategy and its implication that essentially all buildings need to be electrified and decarbonized, connect that down to the individual residential property level. And so we do have a database that looks at that question. I mean, for each home, when was the water heater most recently replaced? When is it likely to need a replacement in the future? And similar for other systems. And so we've been evaluating whether we could provide that data to the assessor so that we could help them provide a more meaningful recommendations at time of sale. And then, of course, our elected officials are free to engage in any way that they see fit with regard to policy. And so that, I think that there is some research at the Board of Supervisors level on other maybe more legislative ways to support electrification, but I'm not aware of active policy and development. So there are ways where we're currently looking at how we can do better with what we have, is the summary of that in terms of policy. And I do think that there's some research going on at the among our elected officials at a residential ordinance.
Great, thanks, Barry. Yeah, getting energy information into assessor info is so important, but sometimes gets pushed back from the realtor community. But I know that would be an important change that we would all support. Adrian, I want to extend that same question to you about single family. Are you considering that?
Yes, perhaps. That was actually when I started with the city, the real direction that I think some of our open space and ecology committee advisory group was really leaning towards. And that was where that kind of look at our emissions profile came in, and switching gears to the commercial sector. Also because of concerns about residential or realtor pushback, like you mentioned. So we wanted to start with the commercial, but we have considered that we may try to fold in the residential buildings down the road, which was why we tried to keep our program name pretty simple. And the other thing that we really wanted to do while we're rolling out this program, I mentioned that we wanted to be able to provide a lot of resources as far as case studies and testimonials and different rebates and incentives and financing options for folks. And we are going to include those for the residential sector as well. So we're going to start kind of more light touch with the just providing more resources to our residents. And I likely expect that our next climate action plan 2020 to 2030 will probably have a measure to extend the program to single family. So hopefully sometime in the next decade.
Great, thanks, Adrian. And Zach, I want to go over to your side now and ask, how does a benchmarking ordinance change how you manage a portfolio in comparison to locations where there is no requirement?
Sure, great question, Ben. So our policy for that we put in place for our client is that we benchmark all energy and water under landlord control, so under our control. So the topic of this forum is you can't manage what you can't measure. So we make an attempt to manage and measure wherever we can. And from there, the next priority is to unlock full building data where we can to comply with building ordinances. So it is, we view the benchmarking ordinances as a tool to help leverage to get more data into our portfolio, but our policy is to benchmark everywhere that we can under our control. That being said, it has been interesting over the past 10 years or so, as more and more of these ordinances come online, we get more access to data by virtue of participating in these ordinances, and utilities having more mechanisms to release data to us. So there has been both incentives to really opt in and embrace benchmarking to get more data. And I've touched upon some positive outcomes such as Energy Star labels for non-office assets, LEED certifications, investor interest by virtue of our participation in GRESB, which does put a high value on data coverage and data access. And also, and this is somewhat of a negative thing, but we also can use it as a stick where if we're having trouble either getting LOA signed or getting in front of tenants to have them work with us on submitting a benchmarking report, we can say, hey, this is an issue of compliance and not breaking the law, so get to it and get it done. So we see both aspects in terms of using a stick and the carrot to get more data, but overall it's been positive and an important tool and point of leverage for us to get more data. And obviously the more we benefit from that data, the more we embrace these types of ordinances.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. A follow-up question to that is, does this benchmarking work with your clients trigger investments? And this person who asked it is specifically curious about triple net leases and the owner-tenant split incentive.
Yeah, we're probably going to need another 2-3 hour forum to talk about the split incentive and ways around that. So the easy answer to that is kind of going back to what I was saying with challenges around industrial and multifamily, where we invest and we concentrate on areas under landlord control. So that includes things like common area lighting. We do a lot of parking lot exterior wall pack LED retrofits, as those savings typically accrue directly to the landlord, as well as water saving initiatives such as landscape smart irrigation controllers. And then the tenants also benefit if they do share expenses by having lower expenses. Typically in terms of working into split incentive workarounds and leases, that's typically done more on the CapEx, our ability to pass through and amortize a big expenditure that does lower consumption at the property in line with the actual savings horizon of that particular investment. Other than that, we support our tenants to do what they like to in a space. If they're under full operational control, we will provide them resources if they need it, but they typically, especially our industrial distribution, logistics center type tenants, they're really their own entities and they operate as such. So there's still some, but again, we focus on where we have direct control and can actually implement a direct program.
Great, thanks, Zach. This next question is for all the panelists, but I'll start with Ammon. Talking about getting stakeholder involvement, both in designing your benchmarking program and implementing it. Do you have any advice for cities on how to do this well based on mistakes you may have made or things you have learned over time?
Yeah, so I have only been with the city of Berkeley for about a year. I wasn't here at the beginning of the creation of BayZone, but I know a large part of our outreach was geared towards realtors and that stakeholder. We only have a few hundred large buildings in the city that are over the 25,000 square foot threshold. And so we did engage those building owners as much as we could, but we have since the ordinance does cover thousands of homes, a large part of our outreach was towards realtors. and working with them. And that's where we, like they're our biggest partner in the ordinance. They do the most communication. And so for us, we closely worked with them to figure out how could, the ordinance benefit both sides. And so, yeah, so that's where we did the bulk of our engagement was with the real estate community.
Awesome. Thanks, Hammond. Adrian, I'd pass that question on to you as well.
Sure. I guess I would say on the flip side, I think the real estate community was one that we could have done a better job engaging when we were developing our ordinance. We really tried to focus our outreach to owner contact information that we had. We also engaged the city's economic development staff and our Chamber of Commerce and presented to their board and sent out some messaging through their channels. But I think we could have probably done a better job engaging with the real estate community to better reach them, and then maybe targeting more outreach directly at tenants using local business license data, perhaps.
Got it. And Barry, I know this might be digging into your memory bank, seeing as you've had your ordinance in place the longest, but what recommendations would you have?
Well, if more than one utility serves your city, make sure to engage both of them at the outset. I don't know if I can answer the question all that directly. It did seem like outreach worked reasonably well, but definitely there were big differences in how effective and how easy to access some of the groups were, right? And so BOMA San Francisco is an example that they're have had continuity of professional staff, regular meetings, and so they've been very straightforward to engage with as a group. And some other groups we engage with a lot at the outset, but haven't always been able to maintain a good channel to their members. So kind of those are both important. And then I think to Adrian's point about engaging tenants, that's not something I'm confident we've been successful with in the ordinance, and we've definitely emphasized it less over the years. In part because there's, particularly as a building gets larger with a larger number of tenants, the connection between whole building annual energy use and decisions by individual tenants, changes some, whereas their interest in ESG and just the decisions made by the owner actually could increase. So it just may be addressed through something other than policy, and which would be great.
Got it. Thanks, Barry. Zach, I would turn that question over to you, but from the kind of owner perspective, what's been helpful for you in terms of engagement that you've gotten either from San Francisco, but also maybe other cities across the nation, and effectively implementing their ordinance and making it a relatively painless, is not the word I'm looking for, but less painful experience maybe for your clients?
Sure. Yeah, and as I mentioned, I kind of had an inside view into that working on the ordinance back in 2009. And I mean, it's been said a million times so far today, but having engagement with the private sector is super important. Invite us building owners to the table. We want to do this stuff. We just want to make sure it's feasible and there's value there. So maybe I can speak a little bit to value. So understanding that the data is being used for high value initiatives. So things like, looking at power density and how that affects certain communities, where investment can be made depending on energy intensity for transformers for the city is important. Access to that data, the San Francisco Open Data SF portal, so you can go in and actually see the data. So that knowledge that we're not just throwing this task of collecting data into a black hole and never see it again, that is actually being used for really important social equity aspects, considerations for long-term conversions to electrification. That's really important to see as well. And overall, and I don't want to pick on utilities too much, I don't know if they're on the call, but the frustration in my experience has really been more on the utility side and the hoops that we have to jump through in order to unlock data through verification of ownership, mapping meters and addresses, and getting tenant authorization when needed and getting those uploaded and having the system process it. That is by far more frustrating than working with the city. So whatever a city can do, or municipality or state can do to really hold the utilities accountable to do this in a good faith effort and to make this as straightforward as possible, because not every real estate owner is going to have one of me to figure this out. So I would put that out there as a way to help bridge that gap for other owners and managers.
Thanks, Zach. And I've got one last question for each of the panelists, and we've only got a few minutes left, so I ask that you keep your answer to 1 minute or less. How can or is benchmarking furthering you achieving your climate action goals? So Barry, if you don't mind, I might start with you.
It certainly shines a spotlight on efficiency, and as I shared in the presentation, we're working to adapt the particular audit requirement to better support the changes that are necessary to fulfill those goals. Just on a response to your prior question, though, with my remaining 40 seconds, I think your report, Ben, is really valuable because the Energy Commission, it's great the Energy Commission's weighed in and is implementing their policy. But what we currently don't have is a kind of centralized entity that's really effectively monitoring the consistency across utilities and the consistency of data accuracy across utilities. And so, even in my personal opinion, even the Energy Commission has finite resources and finite influence over the utilities. And so, just studies highlighting that we haven't quite got it right, I think are really valuable.
Awesome. Thanks, Barry. And Adrian?
Well, being that our ordinance was just adopted in December and we won't have anybody reporting until next year, we don't really know yet. As I mentioned, we're estimating some pretty significant impacts for us in Brisbane, compared to what our opportunity is at a small city, but we'll really find out in the next couple of years as the rubber meets the road.
Ammon?
For us, as we're looking at doing building performance targets, the benchmarks will be the key part in seeing and setting those targets for the individual buildings. And so this year we'll be focusing on getting our compliance up for the benchmarks, and then hopefully in the next few years we'll start setting targets using the data that's collected from the benchmarks directly.
Great. And Zach, how about your organization climate goals you might have, or those of your clients?
Sure. Yeah, we have goals and we're developing a mid and long-term carbon reduction goal. And in general, more data, the better for all of us to inform our decisions and projections and managing expectations to our stakeholders. And one of the best things about benchmarking is there is a direct line from benchmarking through how municipalities are creating their climate action plans. And that's one of the most powerful things to see as someone that is either creating a goal or adhering to a goal or trying to understand the goal and how to get there.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. And one more question to sneak in for Adrian and Barry. How much staff time is needed to implement your ordinance, and how is it funded?
It took a lot more staff time at the outset. So we've been doing it for 10 years, and there were times where we had 2.5 FTE on it, and that was when benchmarking was phasing in and the audits were phasing in. More recently, it's been typically 1 FTE with some seasonal assistance. Funding has varied a lot over time. We got some grant support at the outset, and other city resources have been put to supporting it.
Got it. Adrian?
So for us, we were really fortunate to have the Air District grant to help with our ordinance creation last year and implementation this year. Without that, I, as the only sustainability staff for the city, would probably have taken years to get this done. But I think as far as going forward, we are looking at managing the program in the first year or perhaps couple of years with a Climate Corps fellow. So I do believe my general fund request for that is going to continue to be approved despite the budget woes that all of us city folks are going to be feeling. After that, we're hopeful that it will be part of our regular sustainability program requirements that will be able to manage within my own 1 FTE time.
Got it.
Yeah, I just
Great.
want to add, Ben, sorry, to call out Ammon in response to that question. So, in the time he used to work with us, and it really, in the time that he was with us, he helped upgrade our databases and design the approach to that. And the having an effective database in place was essential for doubling the amount of buildings that were affected in 2019 with the same amount of staffing. So I know he's helped not only Berkeley, but others kind of basically replicate that and draw on what he put together. So I just would highlight that. I know Adrian's took a careful look and took a different approach, but even so, like that's still that theme of the data infrastructure really is essential for managing that total cost.
Got it. Thanks a lot, Barry. Kudos to Ammon. Well, thanks a lot to all of our panelists for providing insight into benchmarking. Super insightful. I really enjoyed being in that discussion with you all. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Great. So thanks everyone for sticking with us. 3 hours is a long time to be on a Zoom call, but we appreciate it and really hope that you got something out of it. As was kind of mentioned in the second to last question, this is a key part to achieving the state and local climate action goals. If we are just modeling data on energy efficiency and guessing how buildings are performing, then we might be disappointed in what the reality is. And some of that shows up in Ben's report with this difference between modeled energy savings and actual energy savings. So understanding what's out there should really be a critical part of all of our climate goals. And hopefully some of the city staff or state staff or Zachary answered questions, and you can always let us know if you have more follow-up, both the speakers, but also BayREN, since we are here to help you out. And if you enjoyed the event, or I guess even if you didn't, please complete the survey, since it does help us a lot. This was our first virtual forum, so feedback is extra important, and hopefully you'll forgive us for the little snafu with the poll. We didn't think all questions would be required. But that's it, and so yeah, thanks for joining. And our next forum will TBD if it will be virtual or in person, but should be happening in the fall. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks.
Good to be with you all.